Welcome, 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 everyone. Thanks for joining me for the Sarcoidosis Clinical Trials and Steroids. I'm so pleased and honored to be your host. I'm your Radio Love Asia from Radio One. If you're curious about sarcoidosis and clinical trials in sarcoidosis, this is the place to be. Today, the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research and aTyr Pharma brings you an informative and lively discussion around sarcoidosis and why representation in clinical trials matter. Joining me today is Dr. Ogugua Obi. She's the director of the Sarcoidosis Foundation or Ctr of Excellence at ECU, assistant professor at ECU, and member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research. Hi, how are you, Dr. Obi?
Hello, Asia. It's really good to be here, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Also joining us is Dr. Sanjay Shukla, President of the Chief Executive Officer of aTyr Pharma. Hi, Dr. Shukla. How are you?
I'm great, Asia. Looking
Good,
forward
good.
to this great event.
Looking forward to this as well. Also joining us is Mary McGowan. She's the CEO of the Foundation of for Sarcoidosis Research, and she's joining us as well. How are you, Miss Mary?
Great, Asia. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Very excited about this discussion this afternoon.
So pleased and honored to have you. And last but not least is Garrie Farrow. She's our Patient Advisory Committee member and Women of Color Patient Advisory Committee member, Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research Patient Advocate. How are you, Garrie?
I'm doing well, and I thank you for the invitation, and I hope we have a lot of good information discussed today.
We definitely will. We're going to have a great time, all for a great cause. So we're going to start with you, Dr. Obi. What is sarcoidosis, and what are some of the symptoms?
Thank you so much for that question, Asia. So, sarcoidosis is a chronic granulomatous inflammation. And the way I really describe it, as I say, for reasons that we don't fully understand, patients who have sarcoidosis, I tell them their body goes into this, their body's immune system goes into this hyperdrive, and they form these clumps or clusters of immune cells known as granulomas. And these granulomas can really deposit or form in any part of their body. The most, commonly affected organ is the lungs. Now we don't know why people develop sarcoidosis. We think it has to do with a gene and environment, interaction. So some people have a genetic predisposition to developing sarcoidosis, and when they're exposed to certain things in the environment, the disease occurs. Now, it occurs most commonly in African Americans, and African American women, tend to have the highest burden of the disease, also tend to have more severe forms of the disease. In terms of how it presents, a lot of people will present with very non-specific symptoms like just being tired, fatigue, not feeling well. But because it affects the lungs in, over 90% of patients, they'll also have, symptoms such as cough or shortness of breath, yeah.
Okay. So are treatments available for this?
Well, first to begin with, not everybody that has sarcoidosis needs to be treated, but for those patients who do need treatment, the current medications, available, the first line treatment is steroids. Now, of course, steroids have a lot of side effects, weight gain, poorly controlled blood pressure. In some patients, it makes them feel very sad, depressed, moody. It can, cause, just suppress your bone strength, so to speak, osteoporosis. So even though steroids are the first line therapy, they have a lot of side effects. Now, we sometimes add other medicines, like methotrexate or Imiran, azathioprine, to help decrease the dosages of steroids that we use. But I think it's important to note here that those other what we call second line medicines are really not FDA approved for treating sarcoidosis. So really, we don't have any medicines that are truly dedicated or FDA approved for treating sarcoidosis other than steroids, which I guess is really important for what we're talking about here today, you know, clinical trials and steroids in sarcoidosis. We definitely need to have several, you know, more clinical trials. We have one ongoing that we'll talk about in great detail today, but we
Okay.
definitely need studies so that we can have medicines that are FDA approved and dedicated to treating sarcoidosis.
Absolutely, absolutely. Garrie, I know that you have your story. You have a testimony to share with us too. Were you ever on steroids?
I've been on steroids a total of 3 times. The most too dramatic was 60 milligrams for a year and a half, and
Oh,
low dose 5 milligrams for 3 years.
okay.
As you mentioned, the side effects are pretty. I've experienced all the side effects from it: the weight gain, diabetes, hypertension. So any other drug than steroids would be fantastic.
So, Garrie, how long ago were you actually diagnosed?
Uh, my memory of 2006.
Okay.
So
You've
18,
been living with this for a while.
quite a
Okay.
while, quite a while.
All right. So we're gonna come back to you and just talk to you a little bit more about your testimony and going through the whole process in and of itself. But Dr. Obi, are there better treatments for sarcoidosis than other than steroids? Are there like some natural type of treatments that you can actually take? What are your thoughts?
So, kind of like we talked about, and like Garrie, you know, mentioned, steroids are the first line therapy, you know, associated with a lot of side effects, you know, weight gain, like high blood pressure, diabetes, you know, lots of side effects. Yes, there are some other treatments, you know, that we use, you know, what we
Mhm.
call the
Mhm.
second line medicines, you know, like methotrexate, you know, azathioprine, Cellcept, leflunomide. And we try to use those medicines when we have patients on high doses of steroids or who are developing complications of steroids or not responding appropriately to steroids.
Okay.
We also have third line therapies that we use in treating sarcoidosis. But I think for me, the take home point is those medicines that we use to try and reduce the steroid doses
Mhm.
are used on off-label basis. That's a big fancy terminology for saying we're borrowing them from other diseases. In other words, we know they've worked in, you know, other diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. We've used
Right.
it for a long time in patients who have sarcoidosis. They do work
Mm.
in patients who have sarcoidosis, but they're really not FDA approved, which means many times it can be difficult to get those medicines for our patients.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Now, Mary, I know that you have been active with the clinical trials. Are there any active clinical trials for sarcoidosis that you can share with us now?
Well, there are, and we're so grateful for companies like aTyr for leading the way towards better patient outcomes with trials underway. As Dr. Obi mentioned, there are currently very limited therapies for sarcoidosis, very few FDA approved medications, and no treatments that are sarcoidosis specific, as Dr. Obi was mentioning. And so it's particularly exciting to see the increased
Mm-hmm.
interest in creating new therapies for sarcoidosis. We've really gone way too long without new therapy development for sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis was first came about 100 years ago. And it's just been far too long. So we believe it is vital to get involved in clinical trials to help us understand why this disease is impacting particularly Black Americans at a higher rate and with much worse outcomes. So again, we're so excited. This is really hopeful for the sarcoidosis community at large. And so I wanted to highlight the trial today.
Right. And Dr. Shukla, can you add anything about any additional trials that you're aware of? I know that there was mention about lung sarcoidosis treatment. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Sorry about that. I hope, I think it's great more companies are getting involved. We have been involved in sarcoidosis now 7 years.
Oh, wow.
We're a public company, and some of the first things I heard when I decided to kind of maybe explore our therapy for sarcoidosis really actually got me a little bit fired up. The first off was steroids. Aren't steroids used in those patients? And steroids are fine, right? They're fine for sarcoidosis patients.
Mm-hmm.
That got me a little bit upset. The second part about that is sarcoidosis is too difficult a disease. We haven't figured it out. It's, doing research on sarc can be really, really difficult. I like the challenge. Last part is nobody really knows much about the disease,
Right.
which I think that's part of the reason we do these sort of sessions. So awareness of the fact that, yes, research will be hard, but we've been in this for about 7 years now. I'm encouraged that more companies are getting involved. I want to highlight something Dr. Obi said about off-label use. One of the things we talk about at aTyr is sarcoidosis demands its own approved therapy.
Right.
It is not good enough to beg, borrow, and steal other therapies, many of which are quite toxic for
Right.
sarcoidosis patients. So we've been committed to really try to figure out a therapy that may be specific, not borrowed, not repurposed, not a therapy that may have failed in other diseases, and let's just try it in sarcoidosis.
Okay.
I know our mission here is really to encourage more folks to get involved. We're proud of the work we're doing in lung, but there are new therapies needed for cardiac, neuro, other areas like that. We're hopeful to explore that at aTyr in the future, but we're also glad that some other companies are also now getting a little bit involved with sarcoidosis and clinical trials.
Right. I know for many people, they know nothing about this. I have to be honest with you. Until knowing I was going to host this segment, I knew nothing about it. So a lot of people are like today years old, just learning about sarcoidosis and what it is and how it affects us. So I'm glad that this is available, that we are out now talking about this and we're sharing the information about the trials and things like that, which leads me to my next question, Dr. Shukla. I know that there was mention of a phase 2 of clinical trials. I believe it's called the EFSO. Why is the EFSO fit different? And can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So EFSO-FIT represents really the first ever phase 3 trial in sarcoidosis.
Okay.
We've waited generations, and as we are trying to figure out the disease a little bit more, but we're proud of the fact that we're the first study to really take a therapy all the way to phase 3. And what does it mean to be in phase 3?
Yes.
People talk about developing therapies. It can take upwards to 10 years, and our journey is already 7 years in. And typically what happens is when you're working on a new therapy, you want to explore it kind of in the petri dish, under the microscope.
Okay.
You hope to see some effects really early on, and that's called preclinical testing.
Okay.
And really early on, just kind of that early research. And early research about 7 years ago showed that we had a compound that seemed to kind of quiet down immune cells. And these are the very same immune cells that are involved in sarcoidosis, sort of the bad cells that are maybe gone a little haywire, in particular in the lung with a number of sarcoidosis patients. From there, we advanced into later phase research, which involves testing typically in mice, looking at what happens to their lungs, and if their lungs are damaged, what might this therapy do? After that, we moved into human trials, which typically are healthy volunteers. That's a phase 1 trial. And healthy volunteers then get the therapy just to make sure no real side effects emerge. And this is really important, that we're trying to replace a pretty poisonous therapy, steroids. We should not be developing therapies that also cause any sort of new burden on the patient. So safety is really important early on, which is why it's tested in healthy volunteers. Then as we finally got to phase 2, which is what you talked about, and that was the first trial that we tried our therapy in actual sarcoidosis patients. This was a trial that was done in about 15 hospitals in the US a few years ago. Dr. Obi was involved in East Carolina. And this trial gave us hints that the drug was doing some really nice things. It was helping patients with their lung function. It was helping them feel better, cough less, have less fatigue, have less shortness of breath. And we were really the first therapy to show this while also reducing steroids. So now we've advanced into phase 3, which is the EFZO-FIT trial, which will be tested in about 80 to 90 hospitals around the world, not just in the US, but currently patients are getting this therapy in Europe and Japan. We're hopeful that in a few years we have some good news. But more than anything else, I think we're contributing to science so that experts like Dr. Obi can hopefully figure things out, more things about sarcoidosis while we engage in this trial.
And AJ, if I can just add here, I mean, it really is an unusual trial in the fact, as Dr. Shukla was pointing out, that it is the first phase 3 trial for sarcoidosis-specific treatment. So this is really extraordinary. And this is really important because in order to get more drugs in development for sarcoidosis, there needs to be successful trials. So we need more successful trials. And the therapy being explored by aTyr has undergone a previously successful trial. So this, as Dr. Shukla was saying, you build momentum on the success. And these trials mean not only getting new therapies, but also provide a lot of hope for the sarcoidosis community. So everybody's very excited and hopeful about this phase 3 trial and very interested in engaging in this effort.
Right. We have a few people joining us on our live stream. I want to say hi to June for joining us today. She said that she's currently in treatment for sarcoidosis. So thank you for joining us. And I want to also say hello to Anthony for joining us as well. We're going to keep the questions to Dr. Shukla. A lot of people are wondering about the trials, particularly, you shared with us why it's so exciting, but are there medicines involved during the trial phase? Do we have something exciting to look forward to for actual medical treatments during this process?
Yeah, so our therapy, which is called efzofitimod, it's a long name, is a therapy designed to help patients who have lung sarcoidosis, pulmonary sarcoidosis, hopefully improve their quality of life. And while doing so, also removing steroids. So one of the things I talked about is how we've used steroids. I've used steroids, and many experts do. Dr. Obi does probably too, as really a burdensome, toxic, I call it kind of a poisonous therapy. So it's a bad choice for SARC patients to have to go on a drug like that to maintain some quality of life. Our therapy, we're hopeful, will reduce or maybe even replace the amount of steroids completely that they have to take, while also improve their quality of life. So it's a trial that, when I was in training a long time ago in Washington, D.C., it's a kind of therapy that you want to be able to have the community have access to and say, look, this will not only reduce that medication which you hate taking, which is steroids, but it also improves your quality of life. Now, in the background, if it can also improve lung function with those more sophisticated measures, then experts like Dr. Obi will really get excited because it's checking all the boxes. So we did that in the last trial, which was 37 patients. Now we're trying to do it in about 260 patients.
Right.
So we've worked very carefully with the FDA, also European versions of the FDA. There's a Japanese FDA. And we sort of have gotten everybody organized to say, look, if successful here, this should be a therapy that improves your quality of life first by removing some of those steroids. In the last trial, we even saw some patients be able to eliminate their steroids completely. I would love for that to be something that it's not promised, but let's see what happens in this trial.
How can they enroll into the clinical trials?
So this is a trial that the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research is helping with us. You can go to, obviously, their website, aTyr. There's sarctrial.com, efzofit.com. I want to touch upon something here, too. A phase 3 trial typically has, where you want to test a therapy, there will be a placebo arm. And people worry about placebo. But what does that mean in this trial? It just means standard of care. So you will get standard of care as you typically would, but there's also going to be a group of folks that are blinded and they receive the therapy.
Right.
And this is the only way you can really determine whether or not it's really doing something, where patients don't know what they're on. And then when the trial is done, you can compare those on therapy versus those not on therapy. But I think a lot of times patients get really nervous about, what does that mean, placebo?
Right.
Remember, you're getting background care as you normally would.
Right.
This is on top of that. And we may be able to even, get you on your way to getting off steroids. So there's a lot to learn here. And I'd encourage anyone, if they're interested, EFSOFit.com, sarctrial.com. You can go to aTyr, you can go to the FSR. We are working with worldwide patient groups. And the last thing I'll say is, these trials are only successful if patients get involved.
Absolutely.
Having worked in other rare diseases like lupus and cystic fibrosis, there are therapies approved for those diseases. 20 years ago, there weren't. 10 years ago, there weren't. And it's because of the patients getting involved and giving up their time, their energy, their effort, taking time off from work. It's a huge partnership here. And I thank the patients that are already in our trial. But I really want to give a shout out to those patients. They're the ones who actually eventually get therapies approved, more than anything else.
Deb Richardson says that this is great news. She's been waiting for answers like this or trials like this for 35 years. So people have been dealing with this for a very, very long time. Dr. Obi and Mary, you both mentioned that this primarily affects African-American women. Mary, tell us why it's so very important for African-American women to enroll in this clinical trial, and why are we so underrepresented?
Great. Thank you for that important question. So far too often, diseases like sarcoidosis are dismissed because they are rare and also because the disease is more common in underserved populations. So first of all, aTyr's commitment to helping to improve the lives of Black Americans with this trial really is a model for other companies. We need more therapies to support diseases like sarcoidosis that disproportionately impact Black Americans. And we're proud to work with companies like aTyr who are dedicated to ensuring good quality care for all in terms of looking at this when they are in their clinical trials, developing their trials. What we know is that African-American women are 3 times more likely to develop sarcoidosis than white Americans. We also know that African-American women have unfortunately, higher mortality rate than other groups and have the highest hospitalization rate. African Americans are underrepresented in clinical trials at large, and we also see that in the sarcoidosis community. So we encourage African Americans to participate in clinical trials so that the studies truly represent the unique needs of the population living with the disease. We want the treatment development to be effective in all communities, and particularly in the community that needs it most. So we're so grateful to the African American community for enrolling in clinical trials so that we can glean a better understanding, again, from those who have the highest prevalence and unfortunately the worst outcomes.
Absolutely. In researching this again, something that I knew very little about until very recently, I noticed that African Americans were kind of just a little mistreated in some of the clinical trials prior to this, and a lot of the trust was broken. Dr. Obi, share with us your thoughts in this matter.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asia. That's a really important question. I just want to, in responding to that question, I just want to first emphasize what both Mary and Dr. Shukla have mentioned. Sarcoidosis occurs more commonly, 2 to 3 times more commonly in African Americans, than in Caucasians. They tend to have more severe forms of the disease. They tend to have more multi-organ involvement. I had talked about sarcoidosis predominantly affecting the lungs, but it can affect the heart, the eyes, the skin. And African American women are more, African Americans, especially the African American women, are more likely to have multi-organ involvement, more severe forms of the disease. So here we have a disease that is more likely to affect African Americans and to be more severe, more chronic in that population. And here they are underrepresented in clinical trials, which really clinical trials are really the only way for us to first determine effective forms of treatment. That's number one. Establish safety of the medications, number two. And most importantly, number three, be sure that those medicines we're using are effective in all. So if you do a study in a disease where African Americans are more heavily affected and you're, recruiting, not a large population of African Americans, then there's no guarantee that that medicine will work in the African American population. So we definitely, need to emphasize the importance of clinical trial participation and enrollment in the African American community. Now, specific to your question, certainly there's a lot of broken trust in the African American community regarding clinical trials for many reasons. Certainly you have the Tuskegee trials where you had, African Americans enrolled in a study for syphilis, and even though effective medicine had come up, they were not transitioned, to effective medicines, and they just continued the trials on them. There are lots of other, examples. Tuskegee, of course, is the one we're most all familiar with. But I do want to say that, those are very bad and horrible things that happen. But out of those, bad experiences, we now have rules and regulations that govern clinical trial participation. I think it's important to stress that. So in enrolling in trials and asking African American women and men, to enroll in clinical trials, I want to certainly, assure them that those rules and regulations are in place to protect them. Now, this particular study, the EFZO-FIT trial, has gone to the highest standards, FDA, even beyond that, establishing with not just the US version of the FDA, but worldwide, to make sure that we're abiding by the utmost, rules and regulations that govern the most ethical and, the most respectful forms of participation in clinical trials. So I think it's important to emphasize that. Now, we're talking about clinical trial participation with drugs, but I also want to, say that clinical trial participation or participation in studies goes beyond drugs. There are lots of other, trials that patients can participate in that will help us understand the disease. We certainly know that it's important for drug trial participation, but surveys and other studies that help us learn more about the disease in the populations that are most affected are also important. So again, it's been a long-winded answer, and I apologize for the long-winded answer, but I truly cannot emphasize enough that trust may have been broken. But I want to say that out of the broken trust has arisen rules and regulations that have been very strictly respected in designing this trial.
Now, there's some women that have been misdiagnosed for years, and then learning after several visits to their physicians and going to different people, getting second and third recommendations. How can we better serve the community to help them get diagnosed a little quickly or quicker than normal?
I think, again, this comes to raising awareness about the disease. This comes to building trust, with the physicians. I think this comes to empowering, patients, empowering disadvantaged populations that you can truly ask questions. This speaks to, looking up, websites that are authentic or that authoritative on the subject, like the Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research, that can help you with identifying, those signs and symptoms that could point towards sarcoidosis. And I always tell my patients, don't ever be afraid to ask questions. Don't ever be afraid to say, let's just kind of revise. If it seems like you're not, directly communicating with your physicians, most people would be happy to say, let's stop and let me be sure I understand what you're saying. So again, empowering patients is important. And then again, it speaks again to clinical trial participation. The more we know about the disease, the shorter or the more people know, the more we can, make quicker diagnosis. And the more people we can, assure as to one way or the other, do you have the disease or not?
Absolutely. Again, if you're just joining us, we're here today with some very amazing people to talk a little bit about sarcoidosis, the clinical trials, and steroids. We want you all to please share the link, share the page, and join the information, join the discussion, because we're here just to answer your questions, and we hope that you're able to gain a little bit more knowledge. So, Garrie, you have, again, your own testimony. Share with us your struggles with sarcoidosis, and talk to us about you actually participating in trials you yourself.
I was one of those that it took about 4 years before I was diagnosed. I'd been to several different primary care providers with my nondescript symptoms before I was diagnosed. I went probably a good 13, 14 years just coasting on the little bit of information that I could find. As everybody's mentioned, it's hard to find lots of information. Unfortunately, after I was diagnosed, my sister was diagnosed because of the issues I was experiencing, and I had a lot of discussions with her about she needs to go back to her primary. And when she died in 2019, I went back out to the internet trying to find more information because I felt this was unacceptable. Yes, she was older, but she had health issues longer than I did. But because of fear, not wanting to question the professional, and, you know, a little bit of, I don't want to go back to the doctor one more time because I've already been told that this is nothing, don't worry about it. I don't think her care was as great as it could have been. And hearing that steroids is the only medication, that's what actually drove me past my own fear of clinical trials. Because on FSR's website, I've seen different mentions and I went, oh, that's nice. But I didn't think to take that next step. But after death in the family, you realize fear is not an option. I don't have that luxury because there's the chance that my disease can change, and it did, which made me decide to start taking part in clinical trials. I've done as Dr. Obi mentioned, a survey, and then a part of a phase 2 where I'd gotten to the initial testing phase to make sure that my disease fit what they needed before they could go to the next step. And this sounds kind of weird. I was a little disappointed I didn't fit because I wanted to take part and to do my part to make sure that there was another medication out there, but it worked out better for my health that I didn't fit. So, sorry, but yeah, there's the surveys that I had done. It was just discussing what my disease was like, the process for my diagnosis. And it was just a series of surveys over a specific amount of time. Where are you now? What are you taking? And what are the symptoms? So there was so many different types of participation that you could take part in. Of course, my own pet project is I want more medications. So having a phase 3 is fantastic. And it helps others not have to take steroids or not have to take as much, because that's the other problem, is that since that is the only approved one, you can end up with 60 milligrams, or I've heard even more, which is detrimental, especially if you're taking it over an extended amount of time.
Okay. Wow. So I guess that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Dr. Obi, is that since we know that there's not necessarily a cause for getting sarcoidosis, but it could be genetic, having your sister also being diagnosed. I know you mentioned also that it could be regionally. This is globally, right? So is it in one more concentrated area of the world than others, or no?
Yes, so it's sarcoidosis is a global disease, but the incidence or prevalence, so the numbers of people who develop the disease or who have the disease, really varies worldwide. You know, the highest incidence and prevalence of diseases in African Americans.
Right.
So they tend to have more of the disease, and like I had mentioned, they tend to have more severe, more chronic forms of the disease.
Okay. Karen Victory has joined us. She said that she's very happy that we are now having this discussion. She says no more sarcoidosis. So yeah, we don't want this anymore. Absolutely. Please share, repost this discussion, and visit sarctrial.com for more information. Again, that's sarctrial.com for more information. Garrie, you shared with us a little bit more of your testimony personally. Tell us, why does the trial need to have more diversity amongst their participants?
If you have as it is with phase 3, as Dr. Shukla had mentioned, that the number of patients and it's geared towards one group versus another, right, all you can say is that your drug was effective with the group of patients that you had. If it's more male than female, if it's more of one ethnicity over another, that's all you can say. And you hope that the medication will work for everybody, but you don't know until you can actually get it in someone that doesn't fit your initial pool. My thought is that the more people we can get involved, and with sarcoidosis, you already have a smaller group of people that you can pick from, that the more people need to take part in clinical trials to, I hate to say this, for the next generation of patients who could be diagnosed with this disease, to know, what, there was at least 20 Black women in this study and it worked for them. This might work for me. Or there was, 20 people from Japan, or there was 20 people from Sweden, and I'm from that country. I know it'll work for me, possibly. Right. But right now, all we can say is it worked in the group that was tested, and I hope it works for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Mary, before someone actually gets involved, does a conversation start with their doctor?
Yes, it actually can begin with conversations with your doctor. So that's why we encourage patients to bring up clinical trial participation with their doctors. Now, some doctors know more about them than others, but when patients start asking questions, doctors are more likely to self-educate. And this is a really important process as well. We would love to see all patients talking with their doctors about clinical trials so that it becomes part of the culture of a checkup appointment, that it's always in the forefront. We need to work together, all together in the community, patients, physicians, researchers, industry partners, to move the science forward, so sarcoidosis patients receive the best treatments available for their unique symptoms. Recently we did a survey of the Black community, an IRB-approved survey, over 400 survey responses received, and the information definitely pointed to the fact that the African-American community, anyway, was not really being asked to participate in clinical trials. And that was the main reason that they pointed out, in addition to trust, as Dr. Obi was talking about, and some other barriers. But the point was that they weren't being asked. And so, yes, with the doctors, it's critically important to have this conversation on ongoing checkups and office visits.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, Dr. Obi, you probably have a lot of patients that have a lot of questions. How does the conversation start with you?
It starts in very different ways, actually. And just to add to Mary's point, so I've been taking care of sarcoidosis patients now for, I would say, maybe 6, 7, 8 years. But when I first started, I really didn't know much about sarcoidosis.
Right.
And actually, the reason why I became a whole lot more interested in sarcoidosis and decided to, know more about sarcoidosis was because I had 1 or 2 patients who had sarcoidosis, and they just kept asking questions. And they trusted me enough to, learn about their disease. So it certainly made me learn about their disease. And, we've worked together since then. I'm still taking care of them, but we've grown as a unit. So certainly ask your patients. Now, not every physician is familiar with sarcoidosis, but if you do have sarcoidosis, certainly ask your doctor, your physician, whoever is taking care of you, ask them questions about the disease, and be specific about asking questions about clinical trial participation. Now, set the foundation of sarcoidosis research will have, the clinical trials that are ongoing. So you can learn about those clinical trials there. Don't be afraid to say to your physician, if you're not doing clinical trials here, can you refer me to a center that does clinical trials? So for instance, we do clinical trials, but I have patients who are coming to me from, over in one case up to 2 hours away,
Wow.
wanting to be enrolled in a clinical trial. And I will say, great appreciation to Dr. Shukla and to aTyr Pharma. They've been very generous with, compensating patients for their time, for travel, and, for the sacrifice they are making to be involved in clinical trials. So don't be afraid. I do know there are barriers to participating in clinical trials. Certainly, if you work and you can't get time off work, that's a barrier. But don't let those barriers keep you from participating in clinical trials.
Okay.
Ask your physician, come to one of the trial centers. There's several of them in the US, in all parts of the US, I believe. And we would be very happy to work with you to find time off work. Happy to schedule, as best as we can around, your tight or your busy schedule, provide travel assistance and childcare, or at least, some assistance to help with childcare while you're involved with the clinical trial. I think that clinical trial participation is important enough for both the patients, the physicians, and pharma to do all they can to encourage it. Um, like I said, I mean, I keep saying it. If we haven't tried a medicine in a group of people, all we can say is that medicine works. Going back to things like high blood pressure, we know some medicines work better in African Americans than in others, but that's because we've studied those medicines in that population. We'd like to find out now whether this medicines works as well in African Americans as well as in Caucasians, in Japanese. Are there things that we need to look out for? Um, Being in a clinical trial, you're being monitored very closely. So you're seeing the physician in some cases every month, you're certainly on the phone with physicians, in some cases every 2 weeks, with the clinical trial. So you're being very closely monitored. So I always, let patients know we will be watching you. I promise you, we're watching you, we're monitoring you very closely. So those some of the benefits of clinical trial participation, and just responding to your question directly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, I know that you mentioned several times that it affects African American women mostly, and it says it's more severe. Can you give us some examples of what the severities are?
So yes, so sarcoidosis is what we call a multi-organ or a systemic disease, meaning it can affect, in addition to affecting the lungs, it can affect the heart, the eyes, the skin, the brain, it can affect one organ in some people, in other people, it can affect multiple organs.
Wow.
Now, generally speaking, it affects African Americans more severely than Caucasians, meaning they are more likely to have multi-organ involvement. They are more likely to have what we call, this danger organ involvement. So they are more likely to have involvement of the heart or involvement of the eyes or involvement of the brain. So that makes it more severe. And even for patients who have lung involvement or what we call pulmonary involvement, African Americans are also more likely to have the more severe forms of the disease,
Wow.
meaning they are more likely to have what we call fibrosis or scarring in their lungs. So in general, there's more multi-organ, more severe forms of the disease. They're also more likely to die from the disease. In some studies, as much as 12 times more likely to die from the disease. Now, whether that's because they have more severe forms of the disease or they have, reduced access to care, or they're dealing with a lot more health barriers or barriers from, generally being in a lower socioeconomic group, all those things certainly affect mortality or increase mortality from the disease. So yes, more severe forms of the disease in African Americans, which again speaks to the need to make sure we're studying, treatments that are effective in this, particular population.
Are there any key symptoms that you would share with anyone that's listening or watching today that they need to look out for? Because since this has been mistreated, since this has been misdiagnosed, is there something that should trigger you having a specific conversation with your physician to say, test me for sarcoidosis? Like, is there something that if it's happening regularly, you suggest that they at least get tested for the disease at some point? Could you share that?
Sure, sure. So many people refer to sarcoidosis as a snowflake disease because it can really present with very non-specific symptoms. Some of the most common symptoms include things like being tired, just what we call fatigue, diffuse, aches, pains, when it affects the lungs, they'll present with like cough,
Okay.
intractable cough usually, or shortness of
Mm-hmm.
breath. Some people will
Mm-hmm.
present with like, chest pains.
Mm-hmm.
When it affects the heart, they'll present with like what we call palpitations, or where they feel their heart beating irregularly. If it affects the skin, they'll have like specific or diffuse forms of skin rash that we can see. If it affects the eyes, they may have pain or blurring or redness, in their eyes. So
Okay.
I always say to patients, don't ignore any symptoms.
Okay.
When you go to see a doctor, certainly list all of your symptoms
Okay.
and bring up, questions or comments like, could I have a rare disease? That
Right.
might be enough to clue the doctor in to, checking for this. Now, there's no specific diagnostic test for sarcoidosis, but
Okay.
through a combination of, symptoms and I would say constellation of tests, including potentially biopsy, we should be
Mm.
able to make a diagnosis of sarcoidosis.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate you. Dr. Shukla, a lot of people are asking, how can the viewers actually get involved?
Yeah, well, certainly there are ways through the FSR and aTyr and some of the websites I mentioned as well to get involved. I want to touch upon one point before I answer that that
Oh,
Garrie
please.
mentioned about just that willingness to get involved, and maybe she didn't qualify for that study.
Right.
Why do we have sometimes criteria that may prohibit some folks from getting into the study or not? A lot of
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with negotiating with worldwide regulators like the
Okay.
FDA. Say, look, let's just make sure that we have a population that the
Mm.
drug really works on, and we might need to really tighten down the criteria. You may only have to have lung symptoms. I get asked a lot of questions. Could your drug be useful in cardiac or neuro? And I said, well,
Okay.
we would need to test it. But the broader you go, the study then gets larger and larger, and it can get a bit noisy, is what they call it. It's a data term. From a data perspective, is it going
Okay.
to work?
Right.
Any pharma or biotech, you know, should they don't say this enough. No one drug is going to solve it for that one patient. Okay, there are drugs that work well in some people, and there are drugs that work well in others. Sometimes what you try to do is you try to narrow it down on where you think it's going to work best. So at aTyr, we've narrowed it down to where we think it's working best, but it's also based on data that we've already produced.
Mm-hmm.
What I applaud Garrie is getting involved in, even though she didn't qualify, know that when you get into these trials, there can be some criteria, and they're there for a reason, because
Right.
that's the company. In our case, we believe the drug will have the greatest benefit in this kind of patient that looks this certain way from their lung scan or their shortness of breath, things like that, and they have to be on some steroids.
Right.
So that's an important point I wanted to make.
Just a quick question. If someone didn't qualify for phase 1 or phase 2, could they possibly qualify for phase 3 of the trial? Could they just qualify for a certain segment?
Yeah, so typically it can work both ways. Sometimes you go broad early on, and then you learn things, and then you sort of tighten things down. And that's what we've done in this trial. So in
Okay.
some ways, we've tightened it down. In others, in the last trial, we actually had a cutoff of you had to be on at least 10 milligrams of steroids to participate. This
Okay.
trial, we've taken it down to 7.5. That if you're using prednisone every day, 7.5. Because what we learned is there were a lot of patients that we thought might benefit between 7.5 and 10.
Mm.
Now we get those questions that someone's on 5 and they said, I'd love to be in the study. But I have to exclude those patients because we've kind of negotiated things with the FDA to say, look, if we show this, the
Mm-hmm.
drug can be useful.
Gotcha.
I think it's really important what Dr. Obi said. Talk to your doctors, talk to your physicians about not only getting involved, but I would also say patients should demand just better therapies
Right.
and say, has this company produced any data previously? Are there any signals? You know, one thing that happens in rare diseases, as I said, you have to beg, borrow, and steal. I don't think that's good enough. When we talk about diversity in clinical trials, I think we've got to now get to a place where companies look at conditions that right now, like diabetes and hypertension, and say, look, we have pretty good drugs, but now we have to address diseases like sarcoidosis, which, by the way, not to create too much controversy here, it's interesting that we don't have a lot of awareness, but it's primarily afflicting the Black community. And also, if you look at the worst outcomes, and I just saw some data a few weeks ago with Dr. Obi and Garrie on a panel in Washington, D.C. It's also, if you're not white, if you're not Black, it's working class folks. So you start to think to yourself, why doesn't anyone know about this disease, and why aren't there any good therapies? And then you look at who it primarily has bad outcomes with, and that makes you sort of, you know, you do the Arsenio Hall, like, you know, what's going on here? But I do think you got to call it out, and you have to just say, that's also how you build trust, by saying there's not enough good therapies. The therapies that are out there cause a lot of people to feel crappy, and companies need to basically step up. I feel, you know, we have at aTyr, I'm hopeful that more companies do that. How do you get involved? FSOFit.com, SarcTrial.com. We're great partners with people like Dr. Obi. And the last thing I'll just say is, you know, we're going to learn a whole lot. You know, we're a public company, so I always tell folks, look, I'm hopeful for the drug to do well and get approved. But whatever happens here, experts like Dr. Obi, patients like Garrie are going to look at this and say, I'm going to be able to learn something from this trial. I've been involved in some therapies that advanced and helped patients, like in lupus. I've been involved in other therapies where the trial didn't work, but experts learned something, and then 5 years later, there was an approved therapy because you could tweak some things. So we're on a journey together, and you know, I can't not say a few controversial things. It's just not my nature. But if people want to reach out to us, you know, we are there to answer any questions at aTyr.
Absolutely. So when we have viewers who've shared with us that they've been battling with this for 35 years, does it matter if you just been newly diagnosed or if you've had it for a number of years? Can anyone participate in the trial, or are there certain parameters?
I'll just go over some basic parameters. First of all, our therapy, we think, can actually do away with or get you off steroids, or at least cut them down. So we are looking for patients that are on steroids. We think that's a frontline target, if you will, to say we got to do better than steroids. Let's get people off steroids. So if you're not on steroids, you know, you're not going to be in the trial. The other thing is we're looking for people primarily with lung symptoms. So I can appreciate that people have other organ involvement, but we're primarily looking at lung. That's where we're focusing on this trial. If you've been diagnosed, you know, you got to at least have a biopsy-proven diagnosis by an expert like Dr. Obi or the pathologist locally. If you've had sarcoidosis for 2, 4, 10 years, that's you're not prohibited there. And then I would say the other thing is if you have highly fibrotic disease, right now, I believe our drug really, really works well with the inflammation. Not so sure about the fibrotic component. So I've also said, look, let's focus on those patients. And that's done by a lung scan. So there's some basic criteria there, but best to sort of talk to your local sites and centers to see if you might qualify. And even if you don't qualify, spread the word that, you know, this could be an interesting opportunity. You're still going to get really good care. As Dr. Obi said, you're still going to be seen, actually really monitored really, really carefully around your disease. That can be helpful. And in the process, you may also contribute to a therapy that, you know, the 260 patients that are going to be in our trial could potentially lead to helping hundreds of thousands of people if the drug gets approved worldwide. And you'd be part of that sort of that group. Obviously, I'm very excited about getting close here to the finish line. But whatever happens here, we're going to learn a whole lot, and I think it's going to be beneficial to the sarcoidosis community on whole.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Dr. Ogugua Obi, Director of the Sarcoidosis Center of Excellence at ECU, Assistant Professor at ECU. Please let everyone know how they could reach out to you or follow you on social media if they have any other questions.
Certainly. I don't have a very good social media presence, but I am on Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research. So I guess if you go to fsr.com, they have a list of physicians that take care of patients who have sarcoidosis. I am on that list. If you're in North Carolina, in the eastern part of North Carolina, you certainly can check into the ecu.com website. I'm there. And certainly, I would say, please come. We would be very happy to evaluate you and see if you are a candidate for clinical trial participation. Bring your friends, anybody you know who have sarcoidosis. We want as many people as possible to be participants or to partake in clinical trials. And if you're not a candidate for a particular study, there are several other trials ongoing. And if it's not a clinical trial, there's surveys, there's lots of avenues that we can all participate in to learn about this disease more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again for joining us today. Also, we want to thank Ms. Mary McGowan. She's the CEO of the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. Ms. Mary, how can we reach out to you? How can they contact you or follow you on social media?
Thank you, Asia, for that question. So the best thing to do is to really join FSR, the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. It's stopsarcoidosis.org. It's a complimentary membership, and that way you get invited to all of our educational programming. We'll keep you up to date on all the clinical trials that we have on our website and do sessions like this. A lot of robust information for those who are interested in sarcoidosis or living with sarcoidosis and sarcoidosis family members. So it's a great way to really stay engaged and to be on an ongoing educational journey about sarcoidosis and the great work that's being done. Thank you so much to Dr. Obi, Dr. Shukla, and Garrie. It's been an honor to be with you today. And Asia, thank you so much for hosting this. It's great to get the information out. And just in a quick closing, again, thank you to all the patients who are enrolling in clinical trials. As you've heard today, it's critically important, not only for the trials underway, but for future trials. We want to make sure that sarcoidosis has a reputation that clinical trials will be successful and are successful in this space. We need to move the needle forward. We need to get better therapies for patients. We need to get patients reduced on steroids. So critically important, and we thank all the patients for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And really quick, Garrie Farrow, she's our Patient Advisory Committee member, and she's the Women of Color Patient Advisory Committee member, Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, patient advocate. Thank you for joining us today. How can they follow you really quickly on social media?
Let's see. Good Garrie on Instagram. Facebook, I tend to keep kind of hidden, but I'm on stopsarcoidosis.org quite a bit. Just UF is a Global Sarcoidosis Clinic Alliance member. I'm a community outreach leader for them. So if you go to the University of Florida's website, their sarcoidosis section, you'll also find me in there. And also don't forget that sarctrial.com. That's another great place.
And last but not least, Dr. Sanjay Shukla, President and Chief Executive Officer of aTyr Pharma. Let us know how we can reach out to you, please.
I'm not on social media. I'm working hard to try to get a drug for SARC patients, but I'm gonna leave that to the experts. aTyr.com for the company information. Again, FSR, sarctrial.com about our current trial. I tend to get out to the community and also be with some of the experts as well. So if there's any questions for the company, please send them through these other channels. And thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, please repost and share this discussion. Please visit sarctrial.com for more information. And we want to thank you all. We want to thank all of your special guests. I was pleased and honored to be your host today. Again, I'm your Radio Love Asia with Radio One. You can follow me at Always Ask Asia on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And we thank you for joining Sarcoidosis, Clinical Trials, and Steroids. Take care.